All right, class, welcome to the week of February 1st. This lecture is discussing functional analysis and methods. So the take-home points for this lecture are to highlight what are the primary assumptions of the study of behavior analysis, give an example and identify circular reasoning, be able to suggest ways to try and break that circular reasoning, highlight the difference between structure and function of behavior, and identify strengths and weaknesses for observational, correlational, and experimental research. At the end, there will also be a video that is posted on facilitated communication. That'll be part of your videos to watch for discussion. So what are some of the core assumptions for behavior analysis? So the first one is that behavior is part of a material deterministic universe. The goals of behavior analysis are prediction and control of behavior. Behavior is the proper subject matter of psychology, and the causes of behavior are in the environment. So we'll go through each one of these essentially one by one. So the first point is behavior is lawful. And what do we mean by that? And it's actually quite simple. Events occurring in nature, including our own behavior, the behavior of our dogs, our cats, or any other animal, essentially occurs for a reason. In other words, it follows sort of the natural laws of order, and that there are sort of preceding events that are related to the cause of that behavior. It doesn't just come out of thin air. There are actual environmental effects that come and control and predict our behavior. And it's the job of science to do so, to try and identify what those causes are that lead to different types of behavior. So what we mean by that, and probably more importantly, what these laws consider is the fact that behavior doesn't come out of anywhere. You don't do something just because you thought of it randomly or it just came to you randomly. While there are kind of random processes within behavior, it ultimately follows a natural law, and that you did it because of your past learning history and through our evolutionary histories, such that we kind of remove the entire, I guess, language that we tend to like to use, that I did it just because, or it just felt like it. Even though our descriptions are, it just felt like it. That doesn't mean that there wasn't actually a reason for that behavior. It's just a failure for you to necessarily identify the reason at that time. And the reason why we make this assumption is because if we don't make this assumption, then there's no purpose of trying to try and identify what predicts behavior if it can just happen randomly and for no particular reason. So it's the job of science to discover what these reasons are and describe them accurately and as precisely as possible so that we can come to control and predict behavior. And because of this, it means that behavior is amenable to scientific study using methods which have proven useful in other branches of natural science. This means that when we're studying animal behavior and training of people, psychology, training for dogs and cats, essentially this means that the processes that lead to animal behavior follow the same types of rules as does anything else in the natural world, which means that we can study it and understand it more through scientific study and scientific processes. We don't need just expert knowledge. We can do this through a systematic body of knowledge and science. So to be able to do this means that we need to assume that the world is materialistic, essentially meaning that behavior and its causes are real life physical events which can be observed, measured, and manipulated. Sort of where this can break down, or where people get confused, is that your thoughts don't seem to be physical events. But what this is arguing is that while you may have thoughts that are private to you, they're actual things that are happening in actual synapses in your real brain in this world. It's not something that is coming to you through a non-physical means. It is occurring inside of your brain, and it is following sort of natural processes like neurosynapses So in that sense, all of our behavior is in a real world and are accessible by real physical objects within that world. Next is determinism, and that means that behavior is determined by a combination of genetic, biological, and environmental factors. This doesn't mean that there's no sort of randomness in the system, or that there aren't variations in that that everything is following necessarily a rigid rule, and that everything has to be the way that it is. It just means that the reasons that behavior occurs, we think the things that we do the things that we do, are ultimately because there are essentially reasons for them within both our current environment and our past evolutionary environment. So what we mean by that is that while we may not necessarily be able to predict exactly what you will do at any given moment, because there's inherent randomness in the system, in the same way that a physicist can't necessarily always predict exactly where a ball is going to drop, or when you play that Plinko game on The Price is Right, or The Wall on TV, where you drop a ball. A physicist can't predict that, because there's a lot of randomness within that environment. That doesn't mean that it's following some non-natural order, or that there's something that isn't determined within that environment. Just because you can't necessarily predict it exactly doesn't mean that it still isn't determined ultimately by the airflow patterns, the gravity, and the exact direction and location of each of those little pinpoints. So ultimately what we're saying is that because our world and behavior is materialistic and deterministic, that behavior is ultimately lawful. It follows laws in the same way things within our universe follow the laws of physics. Behavior also is lawful and follows the laws of biology. And with that, it means that some of our goals within a behavior analytic approach, one is going to be prediction, specifying the occurrence of some event based on one's past experience. So being able to predict what behaviors will occur based on an individual's previous experiences. And then secondly, control is going to be arranging those conditions responsible for a particular behavior such a way that you can produce or reduce some particular event. And essentially, this control here is not like trying to control people, or necessarily trying to control dogs, but control behavior through arranging in certain environments. This is ultimately what dog training is. It's trying to control the environment around the dog such that you can produce behaviors that are desirable and reduce behaviors that are undesirable. And behavior analysis is interested in behavior, not merely as an index of something else, but as a subject of study. And what we mean by that is that a lot of times we'll say that, the dog is behaving okay, but it's thinking about something else, or there's something else, why you might have changed the behavior. Did you change sort of the way the dog perceives things? And the point of this is that what we're ultimately interested is in behavior, not some sort of mentalistic approach or some mentalistic in-between of that behavior. Ultimately, what we want to do is study behavior. We can include things like emotion and thinking within that realm of behavior, but ultimately that is our main focus. We're not ultimately interested about something that is separate from behavior. We're interested in studying behavior itself. So because of this, this means that the causes of behavior and where we look for causes of behavior are going to be within sort of genetic, biological, evolutionary reasons, and current environmental reasons. So thinking back, remember to Tim Bergen's 4 questions, there were 2 sort of evolutionary ultimate reasons, and then 2 proximate, more psychology reasons. And basically, we within this realm sort of make the same kind of assumption that to fully understand behavior, We can do so through an exploration of evolutionary reasons as well as current environmental reasons, and that this will fully encompass the causes of behavior. There's no third thing or some third option that is not within here. A lot of times we'll put like cognition in there as kind of a catch-all for something that can't be explained through behavior or environmental reasons, but we have to assume that even things like thinking are going to be behaviors that are caused ultimately by both genetic, biological, and environmental reasons. So one of the ways that this kind of plays out is that it's very important as we're studying our dogs, cats, and even humans, that we look for explanations within the environment for behavior. So a simple example is, let's say, for example, this child is acting out. We might say, Johnny is acting out. We might say, well, why is he acting out? You can say, well, perhaps maybe it's because he has low self-esteem and that's why he's acting out. But then when you think about it, with just simply this piece of information, you wonder, well, how do you know that he has low self-esteem? And the only reason that you know that he might have low self-esteem is because he's acting out. And this doesn't mean that self-esteem is not potentially an explanation here. It just means that you cannot use that necessarily as an explanation if you're just noticing two events. So if you say that the rationale for him acting out is that he has low self-esteem, but the only way that you know that he has low self-esteem is because he acts out, that's not a very useful explanation. In fact, we call this circular. This is something that we do all the time. Why did you go to the grocery store? Because I wanted to. How do you know that so-and-so wanted to go to the grocery store? Because they went to the grocery store, right? We have to be careful that we don't sort of take the easy way out with our explanations and use what we call pseudo explanations or circular explanations, which is basically when we just restate the facts that have already been observed, or we try and add a fake explanation in there without any evidence that our kind of fake explanation is doing anything. So if you wanted to use self-esteem as an explanation here, then in theory, you would have some type of test that has previously been validated that is successful in measuring self-esteem, and that you've previously shown that children that score poorly on this self-esteem task are also more likely to act out. And then you did a different test where if someone's self-esteem increases or decreases, they show increased or decreased rates of acting out. This would be a way to then use self-esteem as a potential cause, or at least some type of relationship with the behavior. However, without any of this information and you're just saying this as a potential explanation, then it's really not an explanation at all and just simply a statement of things. And instead, what we can do is we can look into the environment for external potential causes. So perhaps instead of saying that, oh, it's just because he has low self-esteem, we could potentially identify that there might be a correlation between Johnny acting out and the probability that he's able to escape his own schoolwork. And again, right now, this is just a kind of circular explanation in of itself. It's not a particularly useful explanation. However, now that we've identified something that's within the environment, we can actually manipulate it and we can change things. We can change the environment and directly measure changes in his behavior. While it's less easy to directly change self-esteem or something like that, we can change something as simple as, whether he escapes his work or not. So we can have the teacher prevent escape from work. So whenever he's acting out, he no longer gets to escape the work, and we find that that behavior decreases, then that would directly suggest by manipulation of the environment that it was in fact the escape of schoolwork that was leading to this behavior in the first place. And a lot of times we can use control or changes in behavior when we change the environment as evidence for explanation. So if you change the environment and behavior changes, then that indicates that something that you changed within that environment was important to that behavior to begin with. Once we've identified what the potential sort of environmental explanation is here, like being able to escape homework or not, the need for including self-esteem as part of the explanation is no longer necessary. And according to Occam's razor, it's easier or better explanation to essentially remove it, because the more parsimonious explanation, the one that requires the fewest level of steps, would simply indicate that that the behavior was likely to escape getting out of work. So now I'd like you to think about this a little bit more with dogs and other similar kinds of things. So let's say, for example, you leave the house and you return to this. All of your wallpaper is destroyed. Your friend says, your dog did this because they have separation anxiety. Do you agree? Go ahead and add this to discussion for this video and let me know what you think. So hopefully a couple of you thought or highlighted that the similarity to the circular reasoning with Johnny is also another case here. This doesn't mean that separation anxiety can't necessarily be an explanation. It just means that it would be circular at this stage of the game to use that as an explanation of this behavior, because the only way that you know that they have separation anxiety is by the fact that they destroyed the house. If they destroyed the house, then you say that they have separation anxiety, but the only way that you know that they have separation anxiety is because they destroyed the house. So you can't use that as evidence that they have separation anxiety. Or that you can't use separation anxiety as an explanation for why they destroyed the house, because essentially you could throw in any kinds of words. You can throw in ambivalence disorder, right? You can just make up any combination of words, and you can say, when the dog destroys the house, you say, oh, that's because they have ambivalence disorder. And it might sound logical and scientific, but then you wonder, how do you know it's ambivalence disorder? It's because, well, they destroyed your house. Destroying the house is one of the key signs of ambivalence disorder. So then it sounds kind of pseudoscience, like an explanation, but it's really just pseudoscience. It's just putting a label to something, and it's not an actual explanation. It's perfectly fine to have labels to describe things. And you could just use separation anxiety as a label for destroying the house, but it is frequently used as an explanation as why did the dog do this, because they have separation anxiety. And also the label itself is not necessarily so speaking to the actual behavior itself. Instead, it would be house destruction disorder or something like that would be a potentially good label of that. And it's fine to be able to label that, but you can't use that as an explanation. Why did my dog do this? Because it has house destruction disorder. That's not helpful. And it's the same with our children. Why is this dog or child acting up? It's because they have ADHD. And that's not really a good explanation there, because you're using a lot of times the acting out as examples of the ADHD to begin with. So in reality, you need to be looking for explanations that are going to be more within the realm of environment. So how might you explain the dog's destructive tendencies? You could simply say separation anxiety, but again, you're really just giving a label to what you've observed rather than actually explaining things. So then the simple next question is, how do you know he has separation anxiety? It's because he has tendencies to destroy things. So instead of this being an explanation, it's really a label. So we need to be very careful of essentially the named it, therefore I've explained it kind of fallacy. Just because you've given something a sciencey name, or someone tells you that something has a sciencey name, it doesn't mean that you now have an explanation. So why does dog X, have separation anxiety, but dog Y doesn't have separation anxiety? So instead we need to look at, well, what are the environmental sort of connections between that? Is it related to the owner having a significant presence in the dog's life beforehand? Perhaps the dog has spent most of its time in the shelter and hasn't been adjusted to a home situation. There's a wide variety of explanations we can't potentially get into right now, but simply saying separation anxiety does not provide a sufficient explanation. And it's important that we're quite aware of this, because otherwise we might just stop. We might just say, that's separation anxiety. There's not much we can do about that. Other than, maybe some drugs or something like that, or some training. But if we sort of couch it more in an understanding of, well, what sort of behavioral developments might have led to this, and what behavioral things can we change in the environment to try and reduce this, we start looking more problem solving rather than simply, naming something and stopping there. So other kinds of examples are like, why does the rock fall to earth? And it's because it wanted to, right? If in this situation, it would seem absurd to say that the rock fell to earth because it wanted to, right? And in the same way that we use because something wanted it to, or because something likes it as an example for an explanation all the time, but it's actually a very, very poor explanation because it's circular. In the same situation with this rock, why did the rock fall to earth? Because it wanted to. It's not telling you anything. Instead, you can start looking for external rules or laws that might have related to this, and instead think of things like gravity and the laws of gravity. And that's probably, that most definitely is a much better explanation of the behavior of falling to the earth than simply trying to assign it some internal desire. And the only way that you know that it has this potential desire is because it did something. So instead, we use external evidence through environmental manipulation to understand laws like gravity, which then help us understand why this particular rock fell. So the ways to break circular reasoning are through prediction and control. When we're able to identify what conditions predict this behavior and how can I manipulate those conditions to increase or decrease a particular behavior, we're now able to break that circular reasoning because we're able to sort of control environmental events that either increase or decrease that behavior, or at least tell us when it's going to happen. So in the situation of separation anxiety, instead of just saying, it's because of separation anxiety, you can try and identify the conditions that are related to when this will happen, when it will not happen. You can try and identify what environmental manipulations you can do that will lead to increases or decreases of that behavior, which will then try and identify what are the ultimate sort of reasons or rationale of that behavior, other than simply giving it a name and then essentially stopping there. So the important thing that we'll be focusing on is when we get to behavior, we want to, especially for animal training, we want to break it down and start looking for causes of that behavior within the environment, rather than essentially taking the cheap way out, which is just ascribing some sort of mental situation onto that animal and thinking you've explained it. An excellent example of what not to do is sort of going back to this idea of dominance, right? Why is your dog aggressive? Because it's trying to be dominant. How do you know that it's trying to be dominant? Because it's being aggressive. You've essentially provided some type of explanation that is just a fake explanation. All you're doing again is saying your dog is trying to be aggressive. You're not understanding under what conditions does it happen, what learning histories did your dog have that might have led to this type of aggression. We're simply just giving it a name and people are going, okay, that makes sense. But it's not actually doing anything and it's not getting you anywhere. So it's very important to be able to try and pick out these little snippets, especially if you're watching, dog trainers or listening to dog trainers, and really think of, well, how do you know that? How do you know that this aggression is because the dog is trying to be dominant? And if the only reason is because the dog is being aggressive, then you're in a circular reasoning rationale situation, and you can now identify that this is not really an explanation at all, and it's not helpful, and we should abandon it. So what ultimately causes behavior? Where should we be looking for causes of behavior? The first one is evolutionary, instinctual. Behaviors that have a strong genetic relationship because of the history of the species. Then we'll be talking about respondent or classical or Pavlovian. We have 3 different names for that, just to make it a little bit more confusing. But this is the type of learning experience. And then there's also operant or instrumental conditioning, which is another type of learning that's quite important. So ultimately, these are really going to be and encompass our 3 potential sources of behavior. So ultimately, everything that we'll be talking about will be coming back to this: instincts, classical conditioning, operant conditioning. So we need to be careful that we don't want to stray far away from these by making up explanations, like saying, because my dog wanted to, or because my dog is stubborn. How do you know your dog is stubborn? Because he won't do what I ask him to. All of these are mentalistic explanations that aren't actually helpful explanations. And you need to change the way that you think about these things into trying to identify, well, what might be the ultimate source of this, either through evolutionary driven behavior, behavior driven by Pavlovian conditioning, or behavior driven by operant conditioning. So I'd like you to add into our discussion a potential example of circular reasoning that you may have either heard of before, or you can create any particular topic now and discuss and add that into our discussion, and take a look and read through what other people have added and see if you can identify some of the best cases of circular reasoning, or perhaps some of the most popular ones that you're also familiar with. Okay, so now we want to break down into our next learning topic, which is functional analysis, structure versus function. So when we think about behavior, there's really 2 kinds of important categories. There's the structure of behavior, or the form, what does it look like? And then there's the function. How does it impact the environment around us? So let's take this rat who's pressing a lever. The structure of this behavior is that the rat is moving over in front of the lever and using its right arm to push down on a lever while looking straight ahead. That is the structure, or sometimes what we say, the topography, what it looks like. And there's also the function, which is it is pushing on a lever, which is producing a food reward, which doesn't really talk about so much what it looks like. The rat could be using its right arm, it could be using its left arm, it could be using its nose, it could be using its back legs, it could be using its tail. From a functional perspective, it really doesn't matter. All that matters is that when that lever goes down, food comes. Behavior analysis tends to emphasize the importance of the functional relationship rather than the structural relationship. There are most definitely important times when structure is important, but ultimately function is going to largely be the main drivers for learning through instrumental conditioning. Another example you can use is like opening a door, right? You can open a door by pushing the bar to the door with your right arm. You could use your left arm. You could use your, the side or hip to push it open. You could use your back to push it open. All of these are having the same function, which is opening the door, but they all look slightly different. Ultimately, the sort of reason why you're doing this is to be able to get out of the classroom. And if that's the case, then the function is more important, getting out of the classroom, than is going to be the structure of, did you use your right arm or did you use your left arm? A lot of areas tend to focus on structure, what it looks like, rather than function. But behavior analysis is going to largely, what we'll be talking about is largely be interested and focused on function. In particular, this comes up with aggression. A lot of times we talk about aggression by particular focus onto, what did the dog look like? Was it directed towards a stranger? Was it directed towards a dog? Was it directed to an owner? Did they have their ears back? Did they open their mouth completely? Did they hold on? Did they grab on for a long period of time? We spend a lot of time trying to analyze the structure of the behavior, when ultimately, if we wanted to change the behavior, it's less about what the structure looks like. A bite is a bite. It's more about, well, why did they bite? Was it out of fear? Was it to get another dog to move away from something? Was it because in the past that whenever someone approached their food bowl, they would take it away, and they learned that turning around and biting at that person would prevent them from taking the food away? In all of these cases, trying to understand that functional relationship, it becomes quite clear that it doesn't really matter if the dog used all teeth or 2 teeth or 1 tooth, with their head turned. That structure doesn't make much difference, but ultimately there's a massive difference between why the dog is doing it. Because if it's out of fear, then you want to create a treatment plan that's related to fear. If it's related to having their food taken away, then you can have a completely different treatment plan related to having food taken away. So here, function is again going to be the more important thing to be looking at, which is really our why question. Why are they doing this? What role reinforcer does it serve? Versus structure of what does it look like? We have 3 units of behavior. We'll be talking about them quite frequently. We call them the ABCs of behavior. A stands for antecedent, or what comes before. B stands for behavior. And then C stands for consequence, what comes after the behavior. And generally, stimuli or things that are within the environment or environmental events are going to be our A's and our C's. So they're going to be our things that come before the behavior, but also the consequences, the reinforcers or the punishers that come after behavior. And then our behavioral event itself is going to be our B. What is the actual behavior that we're interested in measuring? So A and C are our stimuli, and our responses tend to be behavior, or will be behavior. When we're doing a functional analysis, we're largely finding the relationship between the stimulus and the response. So what is the relationship between particular reinforcers and a particular behavior or particular environmental settings and behavior? We're trying to identify that if we change this reinforcer, does behavior go up or go down? If we change this environmental situation, does behavior go up or go down? And this is an analysis of the functional relationship, or what we call a functional analysis. However, ultimately, we can sort of define this even more loosely as finding the relationship between stimulus classes and response classes. What I mean by this is there's a lot of variation in structure of behavior from one instance to another. Like I said, opening the door, you could open it with your hand, you could open it with your back, you could open it with your side. But all of these are basically doing the same thing. They're having the same function. So in this case, instead of just calling it a response, we call it a response class of opening the door, in which it's included a variety of different structures or different looks of the way that you open the door, but it ultimately serves the same reinforcer. And the same with stimulus classes. Perhaps, when you see a particular type of red sign, you stop, but it doesn't necessarily have to be identical. Any red sort of octagonal sign you stop at, even if it didn't have the word stop on it. We would categorize all of these stimuli as a stimulus class. They're similar, but not necessarily the same, but it's a grouping that all produce the same behavior. So a response can be discrete, like a muscle twitch, or continuous, like playing a song, but responses that have the same ultimate function are part of what we call the same response class. So if you wanted to get attention within a classroom, you could raise your hand, you could cry out, you could look, like seeking attention, walking up. All of these are going to be getting attention responses, and ultimately they have the same function, which is to get attention. So we would categorize them all within the same response class, even though they ultimately look very, very different. In terms of a stimulus class, it's frequent that we'll use like a hand coming up as a command for a dog to sit. But you can also use a treat and hold a treat up, or you could say sit. All of these are very different stimuli to the dog. They're hand cues and visual cues and verbal cues, but they're all a part of the same stimulus class because they all produce the same behavior, which is to sit. Or when the dog walks up and approaches the door. Sorry, I missed that one. So as stimuli with different forms may be in the same stimulus class, apparently similar stimuli may also be in different stimulus classes. So it doesn't really matter how closely the stimuli look, we categorize them as all in the same stimulus class if they all produce the same behavior. So for a dog, a sit command may be the same, whether it's inside versus outside. This doesn't necessarily, even though the sit command may look identical, if it only produces a behavior inside but doesn't produce a behavior outside, then they're not necessarily in the same stimulus class. So they're only in the same stimulus class when they produce the same behavior. Okay, changing gears just a little bit. So we'll talk some research methods in animal learning. So there are a variety of types of research methods out there. You're probably familiar with a lot of them. Probably one of the most straightforward. These are less frequently done in a scientific nature, but are typically done more generally. Would be descriptive studies, or what we call case studies or naturalistic observations. You're interested in something, so you just watch a bunch of people doing that particular thing. Or if it was in medicine, you might have a case study where you have a particular dog that you gave a particular drug to and you measured what that response was. From a broader perspective, there are correlational studies where we measure the relationship between two or more variables, and we measure that co-relationship. Correlational studies are very useful because they can help us with prediction. They can tell us that as variable X goes up, that means that our variable Y will probably also go up, or as X goes up, Y goes down. Whatever that relationship happens to be, correlational studies are very useful for allowing us to predict what might come in the future. However, it does not produce causation. It does not tell you whether something is causally related to that, and I'll give a couple of examples. So correlation does not imply causation. These studies are observational. You're doing science, you're measuring things, and you're measuring your X variable and you're measuring your Y variable, but you're not manipulating your X variable. So we call these types of studies observational. They're very, as I mentioned, useful for being able to predict things, but it prevents you from truly understanding if there is a causal relationship between your variables. An example of this is, so here's a graph here on the bottom. Let me try and move this a little bit for you to the top. This is meat consumption in total grams. On the y-axis, we have colon cancer incidence, and we can look and see that in Japan, they have very little meat consumption and very little rates of colon cancer. In New Zealand, high levels of meat consumption, high levels of colon cancer, and the same with the US. So here we have a strong correlation between the amount of meat consumed and the frequency of colon cancer. So looking at this, it might be very easy and desirable to say, eating lots of meat will increase the rates of colon cancer. And while this does allow for prediction, this means that if you ate perhaps 280 grams of meat, it would suggest that perhaps the rate of colon cancer would be somewhere in the high end up here. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's a causal relationship, that it's because you ate meat that you will have this incidence rate of cancer. So let's follow up with another example. So here's another strong correlation, about as strong as the one that we just looked at. This is the number of internet users and the frequency of breast cancer death. So here, if you have lots of internet users like Denmark or the Netherlands, you actually have really high rates of breast cancer death. So does this suggest that because your country has a lot of people who use the internet, that there's going to be increases in breast cancer death? Is there a causal relationship there? The answer is probably not. Instead, there's probably an alternative explanation, which might relate to sort of overall age longevity in certain countries that also happen to have good internet. It means that there might be, death from things that typically occur later in life than earlier in life. Here's another one, the total number of fresh lemons imported from the US and Mexico to the total US highway fatality rate. Does this suggest that if as a country we imported more lemons from Mexico, we would have fewer highway fatalities? Or if we stopped importing lemons, would we have an increase in highway fatalities? There's a strong correlation here as it's moving along in time that the more lemons we import, the lower our highway fatality rate is going. That doesn't mean that it's because we've started importing more lemons that we have decreased fatality rate. This is a clearly strong correlation, and it gives you a good sense of being able to predict things, but it's probably quite clear and hopefully very obvious to you that simply the importation of lemons has very little, if essentially zero impact on the highway fatality rate. This correlation is caused by a third variable, which is simply highway fatality rates have been going down in the United States for a long period of time, while at the same time, we've been importing more and more lemons at year on year end. So there are two actually independently occurring things that's not really related whatsoever, but it produces this type of correlation. So again, we have to be very, very careful of situations in which we see a correlation and we want to interpret causation, that we are guided to not make that jump. Another example is on our x-axis, we have ice cream production, and on our y-axis, we have drowning deaths. So as we increase in ice cream production, we have an increase in drowning deaths. So does this suggest that we should reduce the ice cream production within the United States, and perhaps maybe we can save some more lives from drowning deaths? I'll let you think about that one for a second. So instead, what might be the reason? Can you think of a reason for why this might occur? If you look at the months in particular, you can see that June, July, August are the ones with the highest rates of drowning death. As you imagine, are also the months in which we have the highest rates of ice cream production. Whereas in the cold months, we have very few drowning deaths and very few people eating and consuming ice cream. So this is really just a weather effect that occurs to both items at the same time, producing this correlation. But does not mean that if we made more ice cream, we would increase drowning deaths. So to recap, we have descriptive studies, we have correlational studies. Correlation can help us with prediction, but it does not give us causation. The only way to get causation is through observation, measurement, and actual manipulation of things. So for example, if we increased, randomly throughout the year, the production of ice cream and decreased it at other random points throughout the year, we would probably observe that by simply increasing ice cream production, we do not simply see an increase in drowning deaths. And if we stop producing some ice cream for a month, that doesn't mean that drowning deaths plummet, right? So there, by having this manipulation, we can immediately see that this correlation is not related to causation. However, if we do have a situation in which causation is driving things, then very quickly we can see that when we increase our X variable, our ice cream production, we see an increase in ice cream consumption. When we decrease it, we see a decrease in ice cream consumption. There we can see that there's a strong relationship between that through manipulation of our independent variable. So by manipulating our independent variable and observing the impact it has on the dependent variable, here we can start to understand whether certain things are causally related. This is important to recognize because when we're trying to understand behavior, one of the things that we will resort to a lot of times is manipulating things in the environment that we think are related to this behavior. If we manipulate it by increasing it or decreasing it, and we see subsequent increases or decreases in behavior, then we can understand that we have some type of control over this behavior, understanding of what the causes are. Because when we increase it, we see increases in behavior. When we decrease it, we see decreases in behavior. So through manipulation, this is the only way that we can try to identify causation. So experiments can identify causal or functional relationships, and it's the only thing that can. Observational studies cannot do this. And the cause of behavior is basically the conditions under which that behavior occurs. So by increasing something or decreasing it, if we increase and thereby decrease behavior, quite consistently, then we have an understanding of control of that behavior. If you've identified the causes, then this allows you to both provide prediction as well as control. So experimental evidence gives us the best evidence. Sometimes it's not possible, like examples with a lot of nutritional studies. A lot of times it's not possible to simply have people eat what you want them to eat, right? Because they're just going to do what they want to anyway. So in those cases, we have mostly observational studies, which allows us to draw correlations, but it doesn't quite tell us that if you were to switch your diet to one of the ones that is correlated with longer health, that will also produce longer health with you. In fact, a lot of the studies that we hear on the news are actually observational and not experimental. And it's really important to be able to sift through those different kinds and levels of experimentation or research to better understand of how much can we trust the causal relationship that might be drawn. A functional analysis is basically just trying to identify the relationship between our stimulus classes and our response classes. So changing gears a little bit, another sort of important kind of case example of why it's really important to understand and manipulate things when we're going through experiments, and in particular when we're working with animals and engaging in a variety of different tests. It's really important to be looking for third explanations or alternative explanations for the animal's behavior other than what necessarily seems to be the obvious one. Because if you are engaging in some kind of correlative research, you might think that there's a cause between the stimuli that you're providing and the animal, when in reality there isn't. So a famous example of this is the case of Clever Hans. So Clever Hans was a horse in the late 1800s, early 1900s actually, both of them, that was in Germany, and it was reported that he was able to do math as well as answer a variety of questions by spelling out words on this little board here. So here's Hans the horse. He's got this little wood board you can see. He's also, there's a person who's pointing to a variety of different letters. What Hans would do is you could ask him a question and he would use his hoof and tap out the answer. Say, for example, you could say, Hans, what is 2 plus 2? He would take his hoof, put it onto this wood board and go 1, 2, 3, 4. Then he would return his hoof back to the original location. He could do this by spelling out different words, by doing first the number of rows and the number of letters to get to the letter, or number of columns to get to the letter that he wants. And he was very efficient at doing this. He was actually quite incredible at this, to the point that the German government commissioned an entire study to try and analyze, is this horse the real deal? Does this horse understand language? And do horses have this incredibly complex sort of cognitive or complexity into their behavior and language that we just didn't understand or know about? And the commission came down and studied Hans and his owner, Mr. von Ost, and essentially found that Hans was the real deal. He really could do this. He could do math. He could manipulate a variety of different mathematical operations like addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, as well as answer and spell out the answers to a variety of different questions. However, after the sort of initial conclusion of that commission, there was a graduate student that still wasn't quite sure, because so far at that point, The only thing that had been done was observation. Someone would say something, Hans would stop some things out, and then that was about it. But they didn't quite manipulate the questions. They didn't quite manipulate what the person who was asking knew, and they didn't really manipulate who was the person who was asking the questions. So one of the things that they did is that, or what the graduate student did, is that they would ask the horse questions to which the person who was in front of him didn't know what the answer was. And under those circumstances, Hans did not do well at all. In fact, they also did tests where they put blinders on Hans. So what we see here in the picture is Hans with blinders on so that he can't actually see the person who's asking the question. And if Hans can't see who is asking him the question, his performance drops to 0. He cannot do it. So if you say, Hans, what's 1 + 1, and he can see you, he can answer correctly 2. If you ask him, Hans, what's 1 + 1, but he can't see you, then he cannot get it correct. So one explanation might simply be, well, maybe he's just so uncomfortable when you put blinders on that he can't do it. So then there were additional tests where if the person doesn't know what the answer is, or if someone who is behind a curtain asks the question, Hans can also no longer do it. So all of these pointed to quite clear evidence that what Hans was using was very subtle body cues, body movement from the person who was asking the question, and that the horse was interpreting this and being able to correctly provide a response. One of the natural sort of things that occurs here is that if you say, ask Hans, what's 2 + 2, and he starts stomping on this board, what does the person do? He looks over at the board. And a very natural human behavior is when he gets the correct answer and you know the correct answer, you want to look at the horse to indicate, to see, is he going to stop? It's natural for us to look up to the horse's eyes. And Hans became very sensitive to the fact that if I just stop until you look at me, then I get sugar cubes and you are very happy with me and I get different types of treats. And essentially that was what was happening. This is not just an isolated event of one horse in 1911. This is actually something that is important to be thinking about all of the time, especially in our animal studies. And in fact, there's a lot of questions, and there have been studies that have brought into question the accuracy of detection dogs. If a handler has a previous belief or has been led to believe that there's a particular narcotic in a particular area, is the dog more likely to false alert? And the answer is, under some circumstances, yes. So our detection dogs can use handler cueing. A very common one in early training is if the dog is searching through a variety of samples and the dog gets close to the right one, the handler might start getting excited and start putting their hand in their pocket to get ready to throw a treat so that once the dog makes the alert, they have the treat ready to throw towards the dog. And what is the dog doing? The dog is basically keeps going to buckets until they see the handler reach for the treat. And once the handler reaches for the treat, they know that all they have to do is sit down and then they get the food. So these are things that actually are happening all the time within the animal realm. And it's really important to be thinking about how can things like this come and invade and influence the studies that we're doing, and how do we kind of control for them? And one simple answer that we do with a lot of animal experiments is double-blind studies, essentially where the person who is working and interacting with the animal doesn't understand or doesn't know the outcome of things. This is something we actually do with human medicine all the time, right? With the vaccine studies, they're called double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. And what that means is that when you're assigning someone a vaccine, neither the person who's getting the vaccine or the doctors that are interacting with that person know whether they actually got a vaccine or a placebo, basically oil or something that doesn't have any vaccine materials in it, and that is the comparison group. The reason why both the doctor and the person don't know which they got is because the person might think, or because that they think that they got the vaccine, may behave differently that might put them at more or less risk, or perhaps simply their thought process between whether they got the drug or not might subsequently change their behavior and will actually or change their physiological responses. We'll talk about later in Pavlovian conditioning about how the placebo effect is an example of Pavlovian conditioning. But nonetheless, doctors can also unwittingly and unbiasedly, even though they're trying as hard as possible not to have a bias, subtly bias the data towards the towards the outcome that they believe is the correct one, which would obviously be towards the drug. So it's important that both of those individuals are aligned. The video for this week is a very, very dramatic situation that is essentially identical to both the reasons why we have placebo-controlled studies in humans, as well as double-blind studies in animals, and is ultimately sort of an example of this Kleber-Hans effect, but within humans and children. And that's facilitated communication. So I won't talk about that here because part of your assignment is to watch a news program about this situation, and ultimately how different tests were done so that there was blinding between individuals. But I won't sort of go in that detail too much because there's an excellent news program on that is part of your weekly assignment. So hopefully with all of that, we got our primary assumptions of the study of behavior analysis, identified what circular reasoning was and how do we break this, which is largely by looking for reasons in the external environment and manipulating those reasons to see what changes in behavior actually occur. We talked about structure versus function. We talked about descriptive, observational, experimental studies. We also talked about the examples of Kleber-Hans and how we need to be aware of subtle experimental biases, as well as how the animals and people that we interact with can subtly pick up on very subtle cues that we may not even realize or think that we're giving off, and that's an important thing to be controlling for and looking for through the use of double-blind studies.